The wind came down from the north that November evening in 1847, carrying with it the kind of cold that makes a man question every decision that brought him into the high country. Silas Blackwood stood outside his lean-to shelter in the Absaroka Range, watching the sky darken from pewter to charcoal. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from 15 winters in these mountains, that he was in trouble. Real trouble. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the gentle autumn rain that whispers through pine needles, but the relentless soaking deluge that turns the forest floor into a sponge and every piece of deadfall into something closer to riverstone than firewood. His hands were already numb, and night was still 2 hours away. The temperature was dropping fast, that peculiar dropping that happens when rain is about to turn to sleet, then snow. He'd seen men die in weather like this. Good men, experienced men. Men who knew how to build a fire. But knowing how to build a fire and being able to build one are two different things entirely when every stick of wood within 100 yards is soaked through to its core. Silas had already made 3 attempts. The first fire had smoldered and died within 20 minutes, filling his shelter with acrid smoke that stung his eyes and lungs but produced no meaningful heat. The second hadn't even caught properly, just hissed and steamed as the flames tried desperately to take hold in wood that was more water than fiber. The third attempt had been the most promising, burning for nearly an hour before the larger logs he'd added, still wet beneath their surfaces, had choked it out like a man drowning in his own lungs. Now his tinder supply was nearly exhausted. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, but from the early stages of cold exposure. He'd felt this before, knew what it meant. His body was beginning to divert blood away from his extremities to protect his core. Soon his fingers would become clumsy, useless. Then his thinking would slow. Then mistakes would come faster. Then sleep. Then the long darkness. Most men in the high country that winter of 1847 were doing exactly what Silas had been taught to do, what every trapper, every mountain man, every frontier guide had been taught since the first European set foot in these ranges. You gathered the driest wood you could find. You split it to expose drier interior surfaces. You built your fire in a sheltered spot, maybe under an overhang or behind a windbreak. You started with the smallest, driest kindling and worked your way up to larger pieces, feeding the fire carefully, nursing it like a sick child until it was strong enough to take bigger fuel. This was the method. This was how men survived. This was proven wisdom passed from French-Canadian voyageurs to American trappers, from old hands to green recruits, from fathers to sons. Split the wood fine. Keep it close to your body to dry it with your own heat. Build a reflector behind your fire to throw warmth back into your shelter. Create a bed of coals before adding bigger logs. Guard your fire like you'd guard your last bullet. Silas had done all of it, every step, every precaution. And he was still freezing. The problem was simple physics, though Silas wouldn't have used those words. When wood is saturated with water, that water has to boil away before the wood can burn. Every bit of heat the fire produces goes first into turning water into steam instead of into maintaining the combustion temperature of the wood itself. With damp wood, this is manageable. With truly wet wood, the kind you get after 3 days of cold rain in November, it becomes a losing battle. The fire burns the outside of a log, boils away the surface moisture, then encounters another layer of wet wood underneath. The temperature drops. The fire weakens. You add more small pieces to compensate. They burn fast and produce momentary heat, but no lasting coals. You're burning through your wood supply twice as fast to produce half the warmth, and in the morning, if you make it to morning, you'll wake to nothing but cold ash and the prospect of starting the entire desperate process over again if you make it to morning. The real mountain men, the ones who survived more than a season or two, knew something that the handbooks and the campfire wisdom didn't always mention. They knew that in these mountains, in this weather, A fire that dies in the night can kill you just as dead as a grizzly or a Blackfoot war party. Maybe deader, because at least with a bear or a warrior, you have a chance to fight. Against the cold, once your fire goes out and you're too exhausted or too far gone to restart it, there's no fighting. There's just the slow drift into sleep and the slower drift into death. Silas had seen it happen to a French trapper named Laurent up near the Yellowstone headwaters. They'd found him in his bedroll, his fire long dead, frost crystals in his beard. His woodpile had been right there beside him. Good wood, too, or it would have been in dry weather. But Laurent had burned through all his dry kindling, keeping the fire alive through the evening. And when he'd finally fallen asleep, confident that the larger logs would burn till morning, the moisture in those logs had won. The fire had gone out sometime around midnight. Laurent had probably never woken up. The cold had a way of making you drowsy, making sleep seem like the most natural thing in the world. That's what made wet wood in freezing weather so dangerous. It wasn't just that it was hard to light. It was that even when you got it lit, even when you thought you'd won, it would betray you. A fire built with wet wood might burn bright for an hour, 2 hours, maybe even 3, long enough for you to feel safe, long enough for exhaustion to take hold and for you to close your eyes. And then, while you slept, it would die, and you'd never know it until the cold woke you, if it woke you at all, and by then your hands would be too stiff to work flint and steel, and your mind too foggy to remember where you'd put your tinder. The stakes were even higher for Silas that particular November because he wasn't just passing through. He'd been running a trap line along the upper tributaries of the Clark's Fork, and he was a good 40 miles from the nearest trading post. 40 miles that would take 3 days in good weather, more than a week if the snow came heavy, which it would. He had maybe 4 days of food, and that was stretching it. His horse had thrown a shoe 2 weeks back, and he'd had to leave it at a lower elevation, continuing on foot with a pack that was already too heavy. But it wasn't the distance or the food or the lack of a horse that worried him most. It was the simple, undeniable fact that he needed fire. Not just tonight, but every night between here and safety. And if he couldn't solve the problem of wet wood, if he couldn't find a way to keep a fire burning through the long, dark hours without exhausting himself or his fuel supply, then these mountains would keep him. They'd add him to their collection of frozen trappers and ambitious prospectors and greenhorn pilgrims who'd thought they were tougher than the high country winter. The mountains didn't care about tough. They cared about smart. And right now, doing what everyone else did, what everyone had always done, wasn't smart enough. Silas crouched next to his third failed fire, watching the last of the flames gutter and die, and something shifted in his thinking. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow, cold recognition of reality. The standard method wasn't going to work. Not here, not now, not with this much water in the wood and this much cold in the air, and this many miles between him and anything resembling safety. He'd have to think different. The question was how. Most men, faced with the same problem, would have kept doing what they knew, just trying harder, being more careful, using more tinder, splitting the wood finer. They'd have worked themselves into exhaustion, trying to make the conventional method work in unconventional circumstances. It's human nature, this stubbornness, this faith that the old ways will prevail, if only we apply them with enough vigor. But Silas had survived 15 winters in the high country, and he'd survived them not because he was the strongest or the fastest or the best shot, though he was competent at all of those things. He'd survived because he'd learned early on that survival wasn't about strength or speed or marksmanship. It was about observation, about seeing what was actually happening instead of what you expected to happen, about understanding that nature didn't care about your methods or your traditions or your faith in the way things had always been done. Nature had her own rules, and if you wanted to survive in her domain, you learned those rules, you watched, you noticed, you adapted. So Silas stopped trying to force the conventional method to work and instead he started watching the wood itself, observing it. Not with desperation, but with curiosity. What was actually happening when wet wood burned? What was working even a little? What was failing, and why? He split a piece of pine with his tomahawk, exposing the interior. On the outside, the wood was dark with moisture, almost black in places where the bark had started to mold. But inside, when he looked closely, there were variations. The very center of the log showed moisture too, but it was different somehow, less saturated. The grain was tighter there, denser, and when he sniffed it, he could smell the resin, still present, still volatile, still waiting to burn if given the chance. He thought about that for a moment. The heart of the log was drier than the outside. Not dry, but drier. That made sense, actually. Water soaked in from the outside. A log that had been dead on the ground for months would be wet through and through, sure. But a log that had been freshly fallen, or a standing dead wood that had gotten soaked in this recent storm, the water wouldn't have had time to reach the very center. But how did that help him? He couldn't build a fire entirely from the hearts of logs. He'd have to split every piece of wood down to its core, and that was exhausting work with a tomahawk, especially with hands that were already going numb. Even if he could do it, he'd end up with a small pile of slightly less wet wood that would still steam and hiss and fight the flames. No, that wasn't the answer. Or at least, it wasn't the whole answer. He turned his attention to the failed fire itself, to the pattern of how it had died. The small kindling had burned fast and hot, producing good flames. The transition to finger-thick pieces had worked, barely. But the moment he'd added anything bigger than his wrist, the fire had started to lose ground. The larger pieces simply had too much moisture, too much mass. They'd pulled heat out of the fire faster than the fire could dry them. But that had happened at the surface of the logs, on top, where the wood was directly exposed to the flames. Silas poked at the remnants of his fire with a stick. The coals were still there, buried under the ash. Not many, and they were dying fast in the damp air, but they were there. Coals. Heat that wasn't flame, but was in some ways more useful than flame, steadier. Less visible, but more persistent. He thought about coals for a while, letting his mind wander through memories of other fires, other camps, other cold nights. He remembered an old Crow man he'd traded with years back, up near the Bighorn River. They'd shared a fire one evening, and Silas had noticed something odd about how the man maintained it. He didn't feed it from the top, the way most white trappers did, piling new wood onto the flames. Instead, he'd pushed the larger logs into the fire from the sides, letting them burn slowly inward, and he'd buried some of the wood directly into the coal bed, covering it with ashes. At the time, Silas had thought it was just a different style, maybe a cultural preference. But now, thinking about wet wood and heat distribution, and the problem of surface moisture, he wondered if there was more to it. What if the answer wasn't to expose the wood to the flames, but to expose it to the coals, to bury it in heat rather than setting it on top of heat? He turned this idea over in his mind, testing it from different angles. Fire burned hot but fast, especially when you were feeding it constantly with small pieces. Flames consumed oxygen and wood at a furious rate, producing heat, but also producing a lot of light and smoke, much of which escaped upward, lost to the night sky. Flames were honest but inefficient. Coals, though. Coals were different. Coals burned slower, but at a consistent temperature. They produced less visible light, but they produced intense, radiating heat. And ashes, which seemed useless, were actually insulators. They trapped heat, held it close, kept the temperature stable. What if, instead of trying to build a fire that burned hot and bright and fast, consuming wood as quickly as possible to fight the moisture, he built a fire that burned slow and steady and almost invisible, using the mass of the fuel itself as both heat source and heat sink? He thought about charcoal makers, which he'd seen in operation back in Pennsylvania before he'd come west. They didn't burn wood in open air. They covered it, smothered it, let it convert to carbon in a low-oxygen environment over days. The wood still released its energy, but slowly, controllably, without the waste of open flames. What if he could create something similar? Not charcoal exactly, but a fire that behaved more like charcoal burning than like a campfire? The pieces were starting to come together in his mind. Split wood to expose the drier interior. Build a good coal bed first, using whatever dry material he could find. Then, instead of stacking wet logs on top in the conventional pyramid or log cabin arrangement, bury them. Actually bury them in the coals and ashes. Let the heat penetrate from all sides, not just from below. Let the ashes act as insulation, trapping the heat, turning his fire pit into something more like an oven than a bonfire. And that led to another thought. If he was creating an oven, he needed to think about air. Regular fires needed lots of air, fed from below and around the fuel. But too much air in this situation would just cool the buried logs, evaporate the moisture without igniting the wood. What if he restricted the air supply, not eliminated it, but controlled it? Let just enough oxygen in to sustain combustion of the coals, but not so much that it cooled the overall temperature? It sounded insane. Everything he'd been taught said that fire needed air, that you never smothered a fire unless you were trying to put it out, that you built fires up, not down, that you kept logs exposed to flames, not buried in ash. But everything he'd been taught was failing him right now. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered another thing the Crowman had done. He'd had rocks, not just rocks around his fire for a reflector, though he'd had those too. He'd had rocks in his fire. Smooth river stones, maybe fist-sized, pushed right into the coal bed. At the time, Silas had thought they were cooking stones, meant to be heated and then used to boil water in a hide bag. But the Crowman had never taken them out. He'd just left them there, buried in the coals, radiating heat all night long. Stones held heat. Stones released heat slowly. Stones in the coal bed would act like a battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it steadily, even if the fire itself weakened. The idea was coming together now, piece by piece, observation by observation. Not one trick, but a system. A completely different approach to the problem of burning wet wood. He'd need to work fast. The light was fading, and his hands were getting worse. But for the first time since the rain had started 3 days ago, Silas felt something other than dread. He felt possibility. He set to work with renewed purpose. First, he gathered stones, not too big, not too small, and definitely not porous. Porous stones could hold moisture and explode when heated rapidly. He wanted dense, solid river stones, worn smooth by water. He found 8 of them in the nearly frozen creek 20 yards from his shelter and carried them back, placing them in a ring where his next fire would be. Then he addressed his wood supply. He selected the most recently fallen pine he could find, trees that had come down in the wind, maybe a month or 2 back, before the autumn rains had begun. The bark was still tight, which meant the interior might still have some of its resin, some of its fuel. He split these logs ruthlessly, quartering them, exposing as much interior surface as possible. Yes, it was exhausting work. Yes, his hands ached and his breath came hard in the thinning air. But he wasn't splitting them to create dry wood. He was splitting them to create fuel with less distance between the surface and the core, wood that heat could penetrate more quickly. He created 3 piles. The first pile was anything reasonably small and reasonably dry, his starting fuel. The second pile was split wood, wet but workable, for the transition phase. The third pile was the biggest logs he could handle, still in their rounds, soaked through, the kind of wood that would normally be impossible to burn. This was his overnight fuel, the wood that would keep him alive till morning if his idea worked. Next, he prepared his fire pit. Instead of the usual shallow depression, he dug deeper, maybe 8 inches down, piling the dirt around the edges to create a rim. The deeper pit would protect the fire from wind and would contain the coal bed more effectively. He placed 4 of his stones at the bottom of this pit, then built his fire on top of them. For this initial fire, he used his conventional method, his proven method. He wasn't trying to reinvent everything at once. He needed coals, needed a heat base, and for that, the old ways worked just fine. He used his remaining dried tinder, a bird's nest of shredded cedar bark that he'd been keeping inside his shirt to dry it with his body heat. He struck sparks from his flint into this tinder, nursing the ember, blowing gently, adding thin pine needles, then twigs, then finger-thick branches. The fire came to life, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. He fed it carefully, building it up to the size of a proper campfire, letting it burn hot for a good 20 minutes until he had a substantial bed of glowing coals. Then came the moment of faith, the moment when he'd commit to his idea completely. He took one of his split logs from the second pile, a quarter of a pine trunk about 18 inches long, still wet, but with its heart exposed. Instead of laying it on top of the fire in the traditional way, he pushed it directly into the coal bed, nestling it among the glowing embers. He took a second split log and did the same, then a third and a fourth, arranging them like the spokes of a wheel, their ends meeting in the center where the heat was most intense, their lengths extending outward. Then, and this was the part that felt most unnatural, he began to bury them. Using a flat piece of bark as a shovel, he scooped ashes from the edges of his fire pit and covered the logs, not completely, not all at once, but steadily, deliberately, until they were shrouded in a gray blanket of ash and small coals. He placed the remaining 4 stones on top of this arrangement, spacing them evenly, letting them sink into the ash until they were partially buried themselves. Steam rose immediately, hissing and spitting as the moisture in the wood met the heat of the coals. Silas resisted the urge to uncover his work, to check it, to see if it was burning. Instead, he sat back and forced himself to wait, to watch, to observe what happened. For 10 minutes, nothing seemed to happen. The fire had disappeared beneath its blanket of ash. There were no visible flames, just a low mound of gray and black with thin wisps of steam rising from several spots. It looked, honestly, like a dead fire. Every instinct Silas had screamed at him to uncover it, to add more kindling, to rebuild it the proper way before it was too late. But he held still. He'd committed to this experiment. He'd see it through. Then, gradually, he began to feel the heat, not the quick, bright heat of flames, but a deeper, more pervasive warmth that seemed to radiate from the entire pit. The stones were heating, conducting thermal energy from the buried coals to the surrounding air. The ash layer was acting as insulation, holding the heat in, keeping it concentrated around the wood. After 20 minutes, he carefully lifted a corner of the ash blanket with a stick. Beneath it, he could see that the logs were changing. Their surfaces were no longer wet-looking, but dry, steaming quietly as the moisture was driven out by the sustained heat. And at the center, where the 4 split logs met, he could see the faint red glow of wood beginning to burn, not with flame, but with the slow, steady combustion of charcoal. It was working. He recovered the logs quickly, not wanting to lose heat. Then he waited another half-hour, feeling the warmth continue to build, feeling it radiate out from the pit in slow, steady waves. It wasn't as immediately warm as a big, roaring fire would have been, but it was consistent. And more importantly, it wasn't consuming wood at a desperate rate. When he checked again, the split logs had burned inward significantly. The very center of his pit was now a mass of glowing coals, fed by the slow conversion of wet wood to dry wood to burning wood. The process was self-sustaining. The outer portions of the buried logs were drying from the heat of the inner portions, which were burning and creating coals, which were drying the next layer outward, and so on. Now came the real test. He took one of his largest logs, a round of pine as thick as his thigh, bark still on, soaked through from 3 days of rain. the kind of log that would normally take hours of hot fire to even begin to burn. He nestled this log directly into the center of his coal bed, right on top of the glowing heart of his underground fire. He pushed it down, letting it settle into the ash and coals. Then he covered it completely. More ash, more dirt around the edges to seal in the heat. He piled it higher this time, creating a mound about 6 inches above the original ground level. He placed one of his stones on top, right in the center, where it would be heated by the rising thermal energy and would radiate that heat back down through the ash layer. The entire structure looked nothing like a fire. It looked like a burial mound, gray and lifeless. But beneath that surface, Silas knew, or at least hoped, that something revolutionary was happening. That massive wet log was sitting in what amounted to an earth oven surrounded on all sides by heat, insulated by ash, being slowly but surely dried and converted to fuel without the wasteful wood-consuming intensity of open flames. He built a smaller conventional fire a few feet away for light and for immediate warmth, feeding it with small branches and split wood. This fire he'd let burn openly, tending it as needed. But his real fire, his survival fire, was underground, doing its work invisibly. Night fell completely. The temperature continued to drop. Silas sat between his two fires, the visible one in front of him for light and morale, the invisible one beside him radiating its steady, earth-trapped heat. He boiled water for spruce tea, ate a small portion of his dwindling supplies, and as exhaustion finally overtook him, he banked his visible fire and crawled into his lean-to shelter, positioned so that the radiant heat from his buried fire would warm him through the night. He did something he rarely did in the back country. He let himself sleep deeply, not the half-awake survival sleep where every sound brings you alert, but real sleep. He could afford to because he wasn't depending on his vigilance to keep a fire alive. His fire was tucked away, protected, burning with patient inevitability, whether he watched it or not. He woke once, maybe 2 hours after midnight, and emerged from his shelter. The visible fire had gone out as he'd expected, but the buried fire was still there. He could feel it immediately, the warmth radiating from the earth. He uncovered a small section, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The coals glowed red in the darkness. The large log he'd buried had burned inward by several inches, creating more coals, more sustained heat. The stones were almost too hot to touch. He added another large, wet log to the center, recovered everything, and went back to sleep. When dawn broke, gray and cold and still threatening snow, Silas woke to something he hadn't experienced in 3 days. Warmth. His shelter was actually warm. Not hot, but comfortably warm. Warm enough that his breath didn't fog the air. Warm enough that his hands, while stiff, were functional. He uncovered his buried fire fully now, in the growing light of morning. What he found astonished him, even though he'd built it himself, even though it had worked through the night exactly as he'd hoped. The fire pit was full of glowing coals, a vast bed of them, more than he'd ever managed to create with conventional fire-building methods. The stones he'd placed were radiating heat like small suns. The logs he'd added through the night had been almost completely converted to coal and ash, burned from the inside out, consumed efficiently, almost completely, with minimal smoke and no need for constant tending, and he still had most of his wood supply left. In a normal night of fighting wet wood with conventional methods, he'd have burned through twice as much to get half the result. But the true test wasn't comfort. The true test was survival over distance. Could he use this method not just for one night, but for multiple nights? Could he build his fire in the evening, feed it with wet wood that would normally be unusable, let it burn through the night without tending, and wake to coals hot enough to start the cycle again? Could he travel during the day and camp at night without exhausting himself or his fuel supply? Over the next 6 days, as Silas made his way down from the high country toward the trading post on the Clark's Fork, he proved that he could. Each evening he'd dig his pit, build his coal bed, bury his logs. Each morning he'd wake warm and rested. The method worked in rain, worked as the rain turned to sleet, even worked when the snow finally came on the fourth night, heavy and wet, the kind of snow that would normally make fire building a nightmare. Other men would have suffered through those days, would have struggled and frozen, and maybe died. Silas traveled steadily, efficiently, confidently. His fire method gave him something more valuable than warmth. It gave him certainty, the knowledge that no matter how wet the wood, no matter how cold the night, he could create heat and maintain it. That certainty translated into better decisions during the day, a steadier pace, a clearer mind. When he finally reached the trading post, gaunt and tired but very much alive, he found a small community of trappers and traders who'd holed up to wait out the storm. Some of them had been there for over a week, afraid to move, afraid to venture back into the mountains with winter closing in. They asked him how he'd made it through, how he'd managed to travel in such conditions. At first, he was reluctant to explain. The method sounded strange when spoken aloud, almost foolish. Burying your fire, covering your logs with ashes. It went against everything these men had been taught. But he showed them anyway. That evening, outside the trading post, he built his fire using nothing but wet wood from the rain-soaked pile behind the building. He dug his pit, arranged his stones, split his logs, buried them in coals and ash. The traders watched, skeptical, some of them openly doubting. This wasn't how fire worked. Everyone knew how fire worked. You built it up, not down. You exposed wood to flames, not buried it in dirt. One of them, a grizzled French-Canadian named Baptiste, laughed outright. You smother your fire like this, she die, hen. No flames, no heat. You wake up frozen, mon ami. Silas just smiled and kept working. He knew what would happen. He'd lived it for 6 nights. Morning came. Baptiste had built his own fire the conventional way, had stayed up half the night feeding it, and had still woken cold, his fire reduced to a few stubborn coals that he'd struggled to revive. Silas woke warm, his buried fire still glowing, easily revived to full heat with a few breaths of air and a handful of kindling. Baptiste stood over Silas's fire pit, shaking his head in disbelief. Sacré bleu, how is this possible? It's possible, Silas said, because the earth holds the heat, the ashes trap it, the stones store it, the wood burns from inside out instead of outside in, and wet wood, if you give it time and steady heat instead of fast flames, will dry and burn just fine. It takes longer, but it works longer too, all night, without tending, and it uses less wood because you're not wasting heat trying to boil water out of logs exposed to cold air. Within a week, half the men at the trading post were using variations of Silas's method. Some added their own innovations. One man, who'd lived with the Shoshone, mentioned that they used a similar technique for cooking underground, though he'd never thought to apply it to overnight fires. Another realized that the method worked even better if you created a small vent hole to control airflow, essentially turning the entire fire pit into a primitive furnace. The technique spread through the mountains that winter, passed from trapper to trapper, from trading post to remote cabin, modified and improved with each telling. Men who might have frozen to death survived. Camps that would have been abandoned stayed occupied. The simple act of rethinking how fire works, of challenging the conventional wisdom about flames and airflow and wood consumption, saved lives. But Silas Blackwood, sitting in the trading post that winter evening after his long journey down from the high country, wasn't thinking about fame or credit or how his name might or might not be remembered. He was thinking about observation, about how the answer had been there all along in the way Crow elders maintained their fires, in the way charcoal makers converted wood, in the basic physics of heat and insulation that operated whether men understood them or not. He'd survived not because he'd been tougher than other men, or braver, or more skilled with flint and steel. He'd survived because when the conventional method had failed, he'd stopped and watched. He'd observed. He'd noticed what was actually happening instead of what was supposed to happen. And then he'd had the courage to try something that looked wrong, that felt wrong, that violated every rule he'd been taught about fire. That, he realized, was the real trick. Not the buried logs or the stones or the ash blanket. Those were just techniques, just tools. The real trick was the willingness to question your own assumptions when they weren't working. To recognize when the old wisdom, true as it might be in most circumstances, wasn't sufficient for your particular circumstance. To trust your observations over your training when your observations were showing you something new. The frontier demanded this kind of thinking, not recklessness, not the rejection of wisdom for its own sake, but the intelligence to know when wisdom had reached its limits and innovation had to begin. The men who survived out here, who thrived out here, weren't the ones who memorized the rules and followed them slavishly. They were the ones who understood the principles behind the rules and could adapt those principles to new situations. Fire needs fuel, heat, and oxygen. That was the principle. But how you arranged those three elements, how you controlled them, how you balanced them, that was where the art came in. Conventional fires stacked fuel above heat and allowed unlimited oxygen from all sides. Silas's fire surrounded fuel with heat and restricted oxygen to a controlled flow from below. Both methods honored the same principle. They just applied it differently. And that was the lesson that mattered, the lesson that would serve a man well beyond the specific question of how to burn wet wood. The world was full of principles waiting to be understood, of patterns waiting to be observed, of innovations waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to watch closely and think differently. The mountains had taught him that, the cold had taught him that, the wet wood had taught him that. In later years, when Silas was an old man living down in the valley running a small trading operation and mentoring younger trappers heading up into the high country for the first time, he'd tell them about that November in 1847. He'd explain the technique, sure, show them how to dig the pit and arrange the stones and bury the logs. But more than that, he'd tell them about the moment of decision, the moment when he'd realized that doing what everyone else did wasn't going to be good enough. The mountains don't care what you were taught, he'd say, his voice still carrying the weight of those 15 winters in the high country. They don't care about tradition or convention or the way things have always been done. They care about what works. And sometimes what works is something nobody's tried before, something that sounds crazy, something that makes other men laugh at you. But if you've observed carefully, if you've thought it through, if you've understood the principle instead of just memorizing the rule, then you try it anyway, because in the end, the only judge that matters is the morning. Did you wake up warm? Did you survive the night? That's the only measure that counts. The knowledge Silas Blackwood discovered that cold November, the technique and, more importantly, the mindset behind it, spread through the mountain man culture of the 1840s and 1850s. It wasn't recorded in any official manual or government guide. Most of the men who used it probably didn't know Silas's name or where the method had originated. It just became part of the collective wisdom, one more tool in the survival kit of men who lived hard lives in hard places. Some Native American tribes had been using similar principles for generations, of course, though their methods varied by region and purpose. The innovation wasn't the idea itself, but its application to this specific problem, the problem of overnight fire maintenance in wet conditions with minimal tending. It was a bridge between traditional knowledge and frontier necessity, between observation and experimentation, between respecting what had worked before and inventing what would work now. And that, in the end, was what the frontier demanded. Not blind tradition and not reckless innovation, but the wisdom to know when each was appropriate, the humility to learn from anyone who had knowledge to share, whether they were grizzled French trappers or Crow elders or your own cold, desperate observations, the courage to try something new when the old ways fell short. and the discipline to test your ideas against reality, not against opinion or expectation or hope, but against the hard, honest judge of results. These were the men who survived. These were the men who thrived. These were the men who turned a brutal wilderness into a home, not by conquering it or defeating it, but by learning to read it, to understand it, to work with its principles instead of against them. The fire that burns all night with wet wood is impressive. But the mind that figures out how to make that fire possible, that's the real marvel. That's the secret that matters. That's the knowledge that, once discovered and shared, made survival in the mountains not just possible, but sustainable. Not just desperate, but deliberate. Not just a matter of luck and toughness, but of observation and understanding and the willingness to question everything you thought you knew when your life depended on learning something new. Silas Blackwood learned that lesson in November of 1847, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life. The mountains had been his teacher, the wet wood his curriculum, the cold night his examination. He'd passed, and in passing he'd left behind a legacy far more valuable than any cache of beaver pelts or claim to gold-bearing ground. He'd left behind the understanding that survival isn't about what you know. It's about how you learn, how you observe, how you adapt, how you think. And in the end, that understanding burns longer and brighter than any fire, no matter how carefully tended, no matter how well fed, no matter what the weather brings.